All right, now we also have the Auchentoshan. This is the American Oak version. It doesn't carry a year on it, but we can imagine that it's somewhere in that 3 to 5 years as well. This is triple distilled and matured solely in American bourbon casks. So what we have is this is a lowland single malt whiskey. So it has sweet aromas of the vanilla and coconut without the sherry task. Now it's curious, the area around the distillery was damaged during the Second World War, and a bomb crater behind the distillery now acts as a pond for the cooling water. Auchentoshan also, they have a third still that they call the intermediate still that helps give a final spirit strength of about 81% ABV or 162 proof. This triple distillation, in addition to the unpeated malt, gives the Auchentoshan a very light flavor compared to many other Scotch whiskies, kind of the lowland classic style or the lowland ladies. It's actually the highest proof new make spirit from any single malt distillery in Scotland. It's about $50 for a 750 and is released at about 40% ABV. It's a very pretty color coming out of the bottle. I almost didn't want to stop pouring. Oops. Definitely more gold, medium gold, a little less amber. Bourbon cask is really showing itself. A little vanilla and coconut, a little orange zest. Looks like a white peach as well. Looks like a grapefruit character. Very faint wisp of smoke, but soft on the nose. You have to get pretty close to be able to pull character out of it, which you might expect with their triple distilled. Very floral too. Definitely oak and a very vibrant butterscotch character too. The citrus really comes out with water. I'm going to have to taste it again without the water. I got too excited and went too fast. Still the vanilla, the coconut's maybe a little bit more apparent with the water on it now. A lot of complexity, but at the same time, very, very subtle. Remarkably smooth, remarkably cohesive with all these elements that I'm mentioning. Subtle, but it lingers. The finish lingers and lingers and lingers. A little bit of spice with a candied grapefruit, candied orange almost as well. Not really any smoke. A little bit of fruitcake there at the end too. Finishes forever. But that's a tragedy there. Let's try it without the water. Full strength, definitely a lot more warmth to it. But a very mouth-coating, mouth-filling warmth. Leaves you with a little bit of vanilla and spice character to finish. And it finishes forever. As far as the lowland style, to give this a rating, it's a little bit harsh. A little bit rough on the palate, which is likely due to the lack of age, but it's very well put together, and it would lead you to try their other more aged character, their more aged whiskeys. I think for a single malt, lowland single malt, I would give this a 8.1, and personally, it's a little bit rough. The American Oak, for me, is a little overwhelming. I'd like to see a little bit more sherry, a little bit more softer, and a little bit more integration. But the price is very good for a single malt. For me, I think I would give this a 7.4, 7.5-ish for my personal appreciation score. And now we have the Arran, 10-year-old Arran single malt whiskey. Now this regionally is classified as Highland whiskey, even though it is an island style. This was first released in 2006. This 10-year-old whiskey is basically the flagship single malt from Arran, which is located on the same name distillery as the island off the southwest coast. Predominantly aged in ex-bourbon barrels with a little bit of ex-sherry cask. Arran's one of the few independent distilleries. It's actually set up next to Yr and Lagavulin, which provides them with a kind of special source of fresh water for distilling. These are the kilns and the malt houses And then these are the stills, and note those shell and tube condensers and that spirit safe in the back there too. This will set you back about $90 to $100 for a 750 and comes in at 46% ABV. Some are golden amber. So a little more color, maybe bordering on deep. Definitely some rich vanilla, a little bit of cinnamon, and then really warm citrus fruit, and a little bit of spice. Definitely some apple. Looks like a baked apple. There's a lot of warmth to it. This is a little higher ABV than some of the other ones that we're tasting. You're left with a little prickly, tingly feeling in your mouth due to the alcohol. But it's remarkably enjoyable. There's this orange malt character, subtle malt character with that oak. And those flavors with that intensity of the heat from the alcohol are beautiful together. Cinnamon, citrus, apple. And you're left with that sweet, baked character. A little bit of smoke. Almost like the faintest hint. It's almost more earth than it is a peat character. It's like a wet earth. It's a hard one to put water in, even with the high proof. With water, the bourbon cask tends to jump out now. As far as the coconut and the nuttiness, so the wood starts to dominate with the water. I'm trying to find some of the other characters that were there pre-water, but the oak, it's a little bit of hint of apple and citrus, but that coconut, a little bit of char. The palate sees the citrus come back, but you're left with a finish of, very clean finish now with water, but still dominant with oak. Even though this is 46% alcohol, this is meant to be sipped by itself. It's quite delightful. I'm on a little bit of sensory overload with this little creature here right now. It's very well put together. It feels crafted. You can feel the craftsmanship of the distiller less than a wild barley kind of character. It was very enjoyable. I would have to give this, it'd be at a 9, be a 9.0. My personal, I'd be up in the 9, almost 9.5, 9.2. Or maybe a 9.2. The challenge is if you're not drinking it straight, it falls apart. But oh my goodness, when it's straight, even with that high alcohol, it's a very well put together whiskey. All right, now we have the Glenmorangie Original 10. The Glenmorangie was founded back in 1843. Now it's part of the Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy consortium. It by itself represents 6% of the total single malt volume in Scotland. This distillery has capacity for like 6 million liters a year. Now, Glenmorangie was one of the early experimenters with finishing casks, but the original 10 uses all American ex-bourbon barrels. These are the tallest stills in Scotland at 26 feet tall. Have a look at these. Look at the swan necks and those line arms, and then a shell and tube for maximum reflux, as we discussed earlier. Now, the way that such a large producer guarantees their access to American oak barrels, they actually own their own forests in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. They build their new casks and dry them for a couple years, and then they lease them over to Jack Daniels and Heaven Hill for them to mature their bourbon in for about 4 years. And then they break them down and ship them back to Scotland. Now the Glenmorangie. Definitely lighter intensity. It's a pale gold. Doesn't have the amber notes of some of our other ones there. Medium to light intensity. You have to get rather deep. And then a lot of fruit, a lot of citrus fruit. There's apples and oranges. Just a little bit of plum as well. No phenolics, like no peat coming off. Very light on the palate. Quite pleasant drinking, although it's falling apart after a few seconds here. Turning a little bit nutty, a little bit sweet, Feels a little thin, a little bit of orange. The orange kind of fades to bitter orange rind with time and gets increasingly bitter. It's not too harsh, though. It's a very subtle whiskey, so even when the bitterness is subtle as well. It starts well and then finishes a little awkwardly, but quite easy drinking. I can see this being a very, well, it is very popular. It's one of the biggest sellers that there is. It encourages you to keep drinking so that you don't have to deal with that finish. The wood comes out with the water, and it's that coconut. It's that American bourbon barrel character. Could be confused for a bourbon on the nose with water. A little bit of sweet character and oak. So there are oranges, a little bit of orange blossom, a little bit of floral, but orange is the dominant characteristic here, with maybe a little bit of cream. The water softens the finish. Actually, with water, you do have a lot of oak character, almost overwhelming oak, but then it softens the bitterness of that finish rather nicely. As far as a rating for this whiskey, I think that we're in the eights, probably solid 8.5, so 8.4, 8.5 for this. Personally, it's a little rough, and there's something awkward about it that doesn't really sit well with me personally. So I would be in the for me, it's about a 7 for a personal score. Now we have the Lagavulin, which is an 8-year-old single malt from Islay. Now, the Lagavulin distillery on Islay is one of the most distinctive distilleries in all of Scotland. You've got the peat and the iodine of the sea that gives the single malts kind of a pungent, smoky flavor with the sea salt and all sorts of crazy character in here. Many consider it one of the smokiest whiskeys. It's going to be fun to taste this guy. Now, the distillery's water source, which is Lochlan Shrolum, is about 200 meters above sea level, and the water flows down through the hillside through the peat. And this water supposedly helps give the whiskey a distinctive peaty taste just from the water. Now, of all the Islay whiskeys, Lagavulin has the slowest distillation. First distillation is about 5 hours, and then more than 9 hours for the second there, too. Their stills are short and squat. Notice the line arm heads down, too. Wash stills are filled to about 95% capacity, which gives less contact between the alcohol vapors and the copper sides of the still. Some of the heavier elements from the vapor are attracted to the copper, resulting in a cleaner and softer taste. But as always, the less contact, the more of those fusel alcohols you can get. The cut, or what's taken out of the spirit still, is larger than at most distilleries, with a focus on character so you can get more of those phenolic compounds. These are their beautiful wood fermentation tanks. A lot of character coming out of these. As many other producers do, they use a combination of ex-bourbon barrels and sherry casks. The warehouses are all exposed to the sea, so the casks absorb the typical sea iodine character as well. They bottle this up at about 48% ABV, and it's around $55 to $60 for $7.50. Now the Lagavulin 8-year-old. Already this whiskey is showing itself on the nose from this range. Woo, there she goes. Maybe a lighter color than some of our other ones. Surprisingly light. Gold and a little bit of amber, but mostly gold. Pale gold on the color. It's like a smoked tea. That peat, iodine, pungent, smoky, but a sweet smoke. And you notice how close. The intensity is remarkable. It's definitely leaping out of the glass here. Definitely medicinal. Again, it smells like a first aid kit when you open it. But it does transport you. I've been lucky enough to spend some time on the coast in Scotland, and there's a particular briny smell at low tide with the seaweed on the rocky beaches, and it transports you there right off the nose. See what happens on the palate. Pretty weighty body. First hit of the palate, awful lot going on. After a few seconds, though, it turns rough. Turns a little bit harsh, almost muddy. Definitely still sea salt. There's a little bit of fruit hanging in there, but there is that pungent smokiness, almost like that black tea, oily bitterness. lingers and lingers and lingers. It's very interesting because the first hit on the palate is a little bit rich, and then it turns harsh, and then it finishes much more mellow than you expect. It's got kind of a jumble roughness in the middle of it, but it finishes quite nicely. You're left with that faint smoke and peat, definitely peat. Try with a little water. Definitely a peat fire, now diluted. The little bit of fruit is now fading. Now it's just the rocky shoreline, smell of salt spray and a fire, wood smoke. A little bit of water softens that hit that it has without water, smooths it out, mellows it. It's definitely more approachable with a little bit of water, but you can taste the squatness of the still. There's an oiliness, there's a smokiness, there's a heaviness to it that belies the color of it. There's a weight to it. Definitely a little bit more fusel, a little bit more of the tails coming through. You can tell there's both bourbon and sherry cask here. I don't think either one is overwhelming. It's hard to get a good oak character because of the nature of the peat. The peat is so strong. But it's strong, it's dominant, but it doesn't overwhelm the rest of it. So it's a well done whiskey. For a rating, I would say it's a little unbalanced. So I think we're in the between 7.5 and 8. So like a 7.7. Personally, my personal rating for it, appreciation, I feel it's also it's a little awkward. It's a little unsettled. It's like trying too hard to be peaty. I would give it, for me, it's more like a 7, right at 7.1 for personal rating.